This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the Ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths, and or talk about unitary executive power or any other weird Dick Cheney theory that you might have a weird obsession about. You should, if you really like those, you should listen to our last mini with Laura Dickinson, who gave an incredible deep dive on that. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Shulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
And we are back. And finally, just as we begin our episode, my dog has finished eating her dinner and drinking her water all at one time, which I appreciate. Thank you, Eliza. So we're recording today on Monday, October 27th. When I was in the car this morning on the way to a doctor's appointment, I learned that the French had arrested 2 of the people who had apparently broken into the Louvre and stolen the crown jewels. And much to my disbelief / sadness, it was not the Pink Panther gang or anyone else like weirdly famous. It was like 2 randos. But a more important question that I really have for everybody is, if you were going to do an art heist, which museum would you target?
I mean, the smaller European ones, although not that the Louvre is small, seem to have much less security, right? Like people with some frequency seem to just walk in and take things off walls and walk out. That's how Edvard Munch's Scream got stolen once upon a time. Oh, I don't know. Maybe that's it. That's a good question. I have to. I mean, I guess I like Picasso, but like stealing Picasso's doesn't seem to have. It's kind of banal. Let me think about it. Rada, where would you go?
Obviously, slightly cheating, but the Tower of London and crown jewels.
Wow. Okay.
I'm Rada, and I like jewelry.
Okay.
Big diamonds. And they're from India, and
it's true.
So I wanted to use this as an excuse to just like talk about the Thomas Crown Affair for a while, because like, God, that's a great movie.
It so is.
Also, it really is. And also, if you've ever seen, there's like a terrible, terrible Sesame Street. It's also a wonderful / terrible Sesame Street movie called like Big Bird at the Museum or something like that, where he spends the overnight at the Met, which is awesome. So like that would be great. The Met would be great. However, if you've ever been to, I believe it is the National Museum of Taiwan, and you've seen the incredible carved pork belly or other vegetables made out of like jade and different things, I would totally go steal stuff from there. They also have these like incredibly intricate sort of ivory weird puzzle balls that are amazing. I would love, it's less that I would like think it is actually feasible to steal anything from there. I just want all the things there. Erin, did you decide?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you could do something cool at the Vasa Museum, which is not so much an art museum, but it's the big boat they excavated from the harbor outside Stockholm.
Yeah.
And, I think maybe, there's something cool you could pull out of that. I mean, it's a huge ass boat, so I don't really know how you get the boat out, but work on that. I mean, I don't know how Rada gets the crown jewels either. So, I mean, tomato.
With my stealth moves and acrobatic flips.
Because you had to like go,
That's right,
into a castle and then like into another castle and
into
then you have to
a literal
fortress
that is meant to keep prisoners in. It's not, but maybe I can get one of those German ladders. It worked for the French. I'm just saying.
I just never really understood why in the Tower of London, and like, hey, this is where we keep all of our prisoners that we're going to kill, including the royal family, and also you spend the night before you get coronated. Like, how does that make sense? Like, what is the weird sort of like, everybody dies thing
Very
that like
secure.
the British have going on there? I guess so.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's lots of gossip going on in our universe these days. We have many things that we could potentially talk about, but we are instead going to start with Russian oil sanctions. Erin?
So this was kind of by way of updating on Ukraine policy. It's been a busy 10 or so days for Ukraine policy. There was a meeting at the White House between President Zelensky and President Trump. This often shows up in weird ways in DC. For example, the DC Reddit subthread gets lots of messages about like, why is Key Bridge blocked? And the answer is because the Ukrainian embassy is just across the street on M. Rada probably gets this too.
Also, if you live near there, you find that out.
That meeting did not go great for the Ukrainians. There was reporting in the Financial Times that it was quite tense, kind of almost a throwback to the very confrontational meeting in February. The main headline coming out of that was that the Trump administration would not be sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, which I'll be honest, no kidding. I never expected that was likely to happen. But that was followed by an announcement from the White House that there would be maybe a tri-party, but at least a bilateral summit in Hungary between President Trump and President Putin. However, days later, that was called off, and instead, the Trump administration imposed significant oil sanctions against two Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, which are kind of the two major players that were not previously sanctioned. This has pretty significant implications both for European oil supplies. One of those parties has mostly had to divest or has already been sort of cut off from European oil distributors. But Lukoil apparently has gas stations like all across Europe. So it's not just a supply piece, it's actually a distribution effort. From my perspective, the real question here is whether or not China and India decide to change their buying behavior. Current indications are that there are some near-term effects, but sort of TBD on whether the long-term buying patterns of China and India will change. It just turns out Russian oil is really cheap, and it's hard to, even with sanctions, that may be a cost you're willing to accept. Unless there are secondary sanctions put into place, which would further punish people who buy things from the sanctioned providers. So that's all, I think, very interesting. And like 3 different about faces from the Trump administration on Ukraine policy in like 2 weeks. So I don't know if that's like par for the course, but it feels like a lot. I mean, that's just like more than you would typically want from the White House in any given period of time.
My version in my office of the why is the key bridge blocked is like when everybody suddenly puts in, oh my God, what was that flyover that just happened?
Oh,
and the latest one that like made a really, really big impression. If you live in DC, you remember this absolutely, is when the Poles were in town and they were going to buy, I don't remember, some aircraft.
yeah.
Or they're potentially buying. And like, it was like one of the most intense flyovers I've experienced. And I've lived in DC for 20 years now. So like anytime something loud happens, we're like, oh, the Poles back in town. Sorry, Poles. Like big fan of you guys.
Well, I live
like,
next to Arlington
really
Cemetery,
loud.
so my answer to that question is pretty straightforward. It's a funeral, sadly.
So. Yeah. All right. We have teased for the last couple of weeks, couple of episodes, that there is a new Japanese prime minister. Sane Takeuchi became the first Japanese female prime minister on October 21st this year. And if you probably by identifying her as such, and if you have any way desire to like make this like a girl power or like women rule sort of thing, that she would not be entirely happy with that. She came into power following the election of herself as leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. She is a conservative hardliner. She is often described as a protege of the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And you will notice, if you haven't already noticed, that she has a lot of very strongly held views when it comes to national security, when it comes to the Constitution of Japan, or it relates to defense, and also to traditional values, to include her views on same-sex marriage, on women in leading roles. She only has 2 women in her cabinet. On comfort women, she is not entirely supportive of making policy fixes as it relates to that. Don't stereotype her. She really, really, really does not want that. And she is likely, over her tenure, to look at supporting different changes to the Japanese constitution to make it more, to make it possible for them to have different sort of defense powers, defense authorities, and defense roles than they have in the past. Carrying on her I would say her predecessor, but one of her predecessors, Shinzo Abe's roles in terms of trying to make some of those changes there. I think it will be interesting to see if she takes those on and goes a little bit too aggressive and flames out in some of the ways that her predecessors have in this space. But by being a first, there'll be a lot of pressure on her in a lot of different ways that I think a lot of women can relate to. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out.
Yeah, she's got real Maggie Thatcher vibes, but we do also have reliable information that she has an amazing, albeit Korean, skincare regime.
As we all should.
So my topic is Trump's trip to Asia, which he is currently on. He left, I think, a day and a half ago, and he's visiting Malaysia, then Japan, then South Korea. And I'll just note, we'll talk about this more later, but the government is still shut down.
I saw that and I was like, how are you doing an Oconus trip during a shutdown?
So that's
I
just
actually-
interesting.
Wow. Like none of that had added up to me as like, okay, hey, a bunch of people, I want you to fly with me overseas. You're not going to sleep and you're not going to eat. And also you're not getting paid. Welcome. It's great.
Yeah. I mean, who doesn't want that? So, I think they have baked in some pre-cooked wins like Thailand-Cambodia ceasefire. He's meeting, I think, on his way right now to meet, we're recording Monday night, to meet the new Japanese prime minister. And interesting to see what kind of trades they have there. As Lauren mentioned, Japan wants to emphasize defense more. There is potentially appetite to make a deal. And obviously, President Trump loves a deal that he can announce. And then, there's the South Korea leg, which is intended to finalize this $350 billion investment pledge, but also is coming after this ICE raid that detained 300 South Korean workers that we've talked about previously, and is still very strongly felt in Seoul. So, and there's, of course, speculation of whether Trump would meet Kim Jong-un at the DMZ during this visit. So I guess we can see that. But the main event and my big interest in this is that this is intended to try to help advance the deal with China. So just as a reminder, Trump has threatened this additional 100% tariff that would bring the total tariff rate to 155%. They don't get a deal by November. In response, China expanded its export controls on rare earth minerals, which are critical for all sorts of technology, but also military equipment. And there's just this back and forth on soybean purchases and rare earth access and tech export controls. And it's not clear either side is terribly inclined to back down at present. So I think, what we're likely to see is maybe some sort of tactical ways to delay the escalation with a trade truce and a promise for future deals that are hard to verify and lack details. And then we'll look for more rhetoric later in the year. But I guess, time will tell. These, I will say, in the administration's credit, they are hard to predict. So look forward to seeing what happens with those tariffs for all the things we need for everything in America.
I have not verified this in like a video sense, and nor do I actually want to. But when I was listening to NPR this morning, I heard Stevens keep talking about Trump dancing at the airport. So anyway,
I think that was in Malaysia.
We'll just like
Yeah.
So we'll just like let that go into the sands of time.
Listen, you got to shake your sillies out.
Yep, you all of us do at a regular basis. All right. So, dumpster. Speaking of, we move on into dumpster fires. We mentioned how we are shut down while the president is going on an international trip, which is just mind-boggling as I continue to think about it. Rada, talk us through what's going on?
Yeah. So just in case you, I don't know, forgot about America, we're in the middle of a shutdown. That means that roughly 900,000 federal employees are furloughed. Another about 2 million, including the United States military, are working without pay. This is the 11th shutdown in U.S. history, resulting in the curtailment of government. And I think it is the longest shutdown in U.S. history and the third under President Trump. And the standoff is
longest
largely
full shutdown,
related,
I think.
Well, yes. The core kind of element is related to healthcare subsidies, which has Democrats and Republicans basically at loggerheads. So maybe as just a core starting point, we can start by talking about what is, given that the government does shut down, unfortunately, not infrequently, what makes this shutdown unprecedented or unusual in terms of government operations?
So what's actually interesting is we haven't had a shutdown as associated with a fiscal year end in a while. You would think it would be, and then, but like, no, just we just like keep putting off our work in some points in time, like that. It has not typically happened in that way, but this year it is, which means there's a lot of weird cyclical things that happens along with that, in addition to all of the original bad stuff. So because we have mandatory funding on a lot of important issues, which is great, on Medicare, Medicaid, and other issues, there are things that are continue to function at the bare bones and deliver services in some ways, in addition to those things that are functioning at a bare bones without getting paid, which is an entirely separate issue. So anytime you go to the airport and you see your friends at TSA or you see your air traffic controllers, just know that they're keeping you safe in a whole variety of ways while not getting paid and not being able to feed their families. That makes everyone feel even safer. There's a lot of other agencies that are doing things that are critical to your everyday safety and well-being, whether that be National Institute for Health, Centers for Disease Control, the WIC program, that are either fully suspending operations or partially suspending operations, or to the degree that they're actually working every day, once again, not being paid and not able to get money out the door to their many grant and other programmatic recipients who would be delivering services to the American people. Some things have weird downstream effects. So Social Security continues to be paid, but you would have expected a cost of living adjustment to occur based on the September CPI figures. That is not happening because, believe it or not, I actually probably believe it, our friends at the Labor Department release all sorts of facts and figures that we've talked about in prior episodes that impact whether it be cost of living adjustments or other things that the Fed uses or many other things that private industry uses. Some of those, or many of those, are suspended. Some of them have come through and will impact things like Social Security benefits. But overall, the Labor Department's really important releases are either slowed or shut down altogether. And we're at a point right now where there's a lot of GOP leaders, I say a lot, at least like single figures, are suggesting that Trump seems to be open to shutdown talks with Democrats, because we are now hitting this point of like, hey, is this good for the market? Versus a shutdown is actually causing lots of challenges, the imminent tariffs, and we see ambiguity over responsibility. Like, I think the biggest question is going to be, do Republicans think this is going to impact their chances in 2026? And when that becomes a real thing for them, then they'll say like, hey, hold up.
So before I think I want to dig in on the broader economic and national security effects, I think it's worth maybe just taking a moment on the human impact. So we talked about 900,000 federal employees being furloughed, which means they're home and not working, another 2 million working without pay. So maybe, and then the benefit. So maybe it's worth just taking a minute to talk about kind of what the impact of the government not being open and having money out the door means.
Yeah. So let's start actually with federal workers, because it's really important to associate federal workers are the ones that make the benefits, the distribution of funding, the actual things getting done in the world. They make that happen. So hundreds of thousands of federal employees are furloughed. That means that they are not being paid. And it means that those who are working at all are not. So it means that hundreds of thousands of employees are not being paid. Some of them are working. Many of them are not. So many critical functions that you assume just happen day to day are not actually occurring. So there are over 700,000 that are deemed what we call accepted. So like air traffic controllers and others who are showing up. And again, as I mentioned before, they're doing all this work and have been for a few weeks and just missed their first paycheck without pay. That also includes law enforcement. And pretty soon it will include the military, because even though they've had this brief infusion of pay, that's not likely to be able to continue, particularly since, even though we've had this bizarre donation that we'll talk about in a second, the U.S. military just does not have the reserve funds to be able to continue to do that pay in some way. So that means that, and we'll talk about this in a second, there are many members of the military who receive SNAP benefits who are not able to receive pay at this moment, who are not able to, in addition to that, receive food and welfare benefits beyond that to be able to support their families. We actually just saw, those of you who live in the DC area, the Capital Area Food Bank distributed canned and dried goods only to many households of federal employees and contractors. They had been expecting around 150 people. They had almost triple that almost double that, as they were trying to deal with like that ongoing demand. And many food banks around the country are dealing with this. But stepping back, big picture, SNAP benefits, which are those food and welfare benefits distributed to those who are vulnerable families across the country, they will be suspended starting on November 1st, even though they don't have to be. We'll get to that hopefully in a second. That means more than 42 million Americans who rely on that, children, older adults, people with disabilities, people on very low incomes, will not receive those. And they have to face immediate trade-offs, skipping meals, reducing food, choosing between food and utilities or medicine, and many things that none of us want to face at any point in time. In stresses those infrastructures that would otherwise be able to support them. There's a lot of food assistance infrastructure, your local food banks, who, in addition to the local support they receive, rely on federal support to be able to make their assistance possible. So they've already had a ton of pressure based on higher demand. They are also receiving pressure based on like less support they're receiving from federal and state sources. And all of that funding, if you, for whatever reason, don't care about people going hungry, has a huge multiplier effect, meaning that benefit cuts ripple across the rest of the economy. So overall, we're in hell.
Great. Well, moving from that not very uplifting landscape to the broader maybe industry implications. Erin, I know obviously you've worked in a number of programs that work with industry. Can you help us just think through broadly how's this affecting industry, and more specifically, how do contractors operate when the government is shut down? Question mark?
Such a good question, and the answer is it varies. As we've mentioned, the uniform military is still working, and so to the extent that there are contracting or program tests or other activities that are being executed by military personnel, some of those are ongoing, but they may not have the senior civilians or the junior civilians in their offices to help them do that. So the short answer is they are likely covering down across a lot of areas, and everything at a minimum slows down. At a broad level, the way we understand contracting, for the most part, no new contracts are going to be let until there's authorization for funding. That's not strictly the case, but that's for the most part true. That applies also to renewals, modifications, task orders, all the things that kind of keep the money moving from government to prime contractors, to their suppliers, and ultimately to employees and the like. Sometimes that can result, if there's a significant gap in pay from the government to contractors, people can be laid off. This is probably most acute in companies that do a lot of service contract work. That can be anything from admin staff at the Pentagon to IT services to training or maintenance operations. Those folks are basically paid by the hour, and they bill by the hour. And so if that money is not coming through, there'll be some effort by those companies to hang on to people because there's an expectation that the government will reopen soon, ? But it becomes increasingly difficult to hold on to folks and to essentially carry those individuals over time. I think, much as Lauren explained, there's a lot of kind of second and third order effects that it's hard to fully document or even sometimes anticipate by a lengthy shutdown. Routine activities that become challenging as the longer things sort of stretch on, and they are things that you have to do to basically pull that work back in. It just creates that backlog once the government is properly funded again.
Okay, so that is a not great, but maybe not totally disastrous outlook on industry.
Not yet totally disastrous. I would agree with that.
Not yet totally disastrous. Fair enough. Maybe even more broadly, obviously we'll talk more about this, but the military continues to be active in a variety of settings. And obviously the president is on international trip doing this, doing the work in Asia. So how do we see, or how does government shutdown actually affect national security in these types of issues. And there are a lot of different pieces to this. There's the obviously personnel piece that we started talking about. There's the readiness, and then there's sort of broader kind of operations and activities.
I have learned from history two very important things is that militaries love operating without pay. And even more than that, it is really healthy when super wealthy individuals decide to donate some negligible amount to be able to keep them operating for like 5 minutes or so. That's incredibly healthy for the sustainment of your constitution and your nation. So I don't have any worries about the current situation. Aaron?
Yeah, it's going great. I mean, this goes back to the conversation we had both on the main episode and the mini, I think, last week, which is around sort of separation of powers and, who gets to determine how much money you spend on things. And, in terms of the Constitution, it turns out that's with Congress and not, I don't know, the Office of Management and Budget. And so we're in a weird space, I think, from kind of that perspective. Rada, you mentioned that troops are being paid. They're being paid because we have, I don't even know if I want to call it a reprogramming because I'm not even sure that's what it was. We just took some money. Yeah. We just sort of like took some RDT, some research and development money and decided to use that for, spending on military personnel salaries. It's not offensive to normal people, right? Like taking money for your car payment and using it to like, buy, food is like not a problem in a household budget. But I mean, imagine if your grandparents like gifted you money and they were very specific that this is for school related expenses. And instead you bought a car with it. That's what the Defense Department is doing kind of right now.
Or maybe a different version of this. If you had been saving for a very long time for a washer dryer because yours had been broken and you've been hand washing your clothing, and your husband instead bought like a video game, like 7,000 video games. That's more or less what we're dealing with right now.
I think the bigger issue, I guess, to sort of, zoom out again, I mean, this specific shutdown is bad. That we have shutdowns is bad, but that we have a broken set of appropriations and we cannot have regular planning both within cycle or over the 5-year period is what's really damaging to national security, right? Contractors don't believe they're going to get regular funding. Services don't believe they're going to be able to issue contracts for the first quarter of any fiscal year. So everybody gets a year's worth of funding and has to spend it in 9 months. That's not easy or a great idea. So there's a broader dysfunction that I think this is, an example of.
Well, okay. So maybe then to wrap us up here, like what happens now? How do we get out of this? Are there any realistic paths to ending the shutdown? Yeah, question mark. Ellipses, question mark, ellipses.
Well, what's on the table right now, what the Senate has been basically voting down for, or not bringing to the floor for a month, is this was a continuing resolution, basically allowing for money to be spent through November 21st, which is now quite soon. So at some point, they actually, and I think it's also important to note that the House has been completely out of session for a variety of House reasons. That means that they haven't been, bringing anything new to the table. So it does sound like there will at least be a sort of shift in the underlying conditions the closer we get to 21st, because it means that like what was already agreed to is no longer operative. And the implication of like actually going on a shutdown through the Thanksgiving travel holiday. And both the optics of that, but also the realities of that. I mean, if there was a large sick out by air traffic controllers or TSA folks who at that point will have not been paid for a couple of months, then I think that you're at least you've changed some of the dynamics about where the pressure points are. But I don't think it's a great news story.
Long term, though, I think to Aaron's earlier point, it's making the appropriations process even more of a fiction than it had been before. It's setting, we didn't discuss this, but it's setting a hugely dangerous precedent for us continuing to use bizarre processes in government to restructure government. I think it raises questions for all of us of why you would want to continue to serve or desire to serve in the federal workforce, in the US military, or as a contractor in the absence of being able to rely on pay or ongoing understanding of your duties. And we are not, it's interesting. In the media coverage, you can tell people are not experiencing this shutdown in the same sort of visceral ways they have in the past. We will certainly see that after this November 1st deadline, and have seen it in very targeted ways. But going into the holiday season, I think we'll start to see it in very discernible ways. And certainly it'll be a wake up call for both parties in terms of Americans will punish both of them if they don't take action on this soon.
Well, with hopes that the American people either don't get to that point or get to that point with very sharp punishments. There you have it. It's the shutdown.
So, if you had been asleep for the last year and woke up today and suddenly realized that we were living back in the middle of the Neo Monroe Doctrine, you would probably be a little surprised. To include various facts like that the Forward Carrier Strike Group is moving into the Caribbean. Yes, the Caribbean. That the United States had sanctioned Colombian President Gustavo Petro, accusing his government of failing to stem the illicit drug trade, and that there are victims of U.S. military strikes in the region that are washing up on the shores of Trinidad. All of those things kind of seem like a year ago. You're like, I'm sorry, what's going on? Also, the Monroe Doctrine, I'm pretty sure I studied that in middle school. We are in a drastically different situation right now in the Southcom AOR than we had, actually, technically also some of Northcom AOR, the Southcom AOR than we had been certainly in the last year or so, but definitely in the last 20 years. I want to get into a little bit of like, how did we get here and how this is just like a massive sea change. But really, we're going to extend the bulk of this conversation on like, what is the weirdest thing that you've heard of in the Southcom AOR in the last several weeks or so? But first, I want to start with a little bit of history in terms of most of the time period that we are familiar with, that we have talked about in recent history when it comes to United States interventions in South America, Central America, have been as it relates to counter narcotics and the drug war in the region. I am curious, particularly from Erin's perspective, but both of you, to just hear a little bit more about like how did we get here? What was working? What was not working? What was the landscape that got us to this point in time where we are suddenly apparently blowing up fishing boats in the middle of the Caribbean at this point in time?
So I mean, not a Latin American expert. Did used to do a lot of reading about the FARC, which is one of my favorite rebel groups back in the days when I got to study insurgencies and things. I think it's important to note we're really sort of talking about post-Cold War U.S. policy in Latin America, because Cold War U.S. policy in Latin America had a lot of interventions.
Also very different.
Very different. And, highly variable in terms of both outcome and I would say, general ethicalness. And that very much still flavors, though, however, how countries in the region think of the United States, right? That's definitely a dominant frame of reference for other countries. So in terms of counter narcotics, the main name of the game was Plan Colombia, depending on which side of the border you might be on that. This involved was sort of like I hate using this phrase, you guys are going to die, whole of government approach, like kind of the original, the OG whole of government approach. That had large aid packages, as in distributed by USAID, had a very large embassy presence and kind of interagency workforce. There was a large military set of activities, both overt, so sort of white soft, actual Green Berets, spending a lot of time training their Colombian Army counterparts. Also some covert activities, which you can like read Mark Bowden's book about. There was a lot of different entities sort of going on here, and this is going on mid-1990s. Plan Colombia really starts going in the early 2000s under the George W. Bush administration. And it's sort of an integrated approach to a previous set of activities. This is my favorite part. I'm sorry, I have to digress. That we have to do Plan Colombia because we were quite effective in dismantling the cartels, right? We were quite effective in getting like basically the Cali cartel and Pablo Escobar's cartels demolished. Lots of different like tips and tricks for how that happened. Unfortunately, the FARC took over all of that activity and became a completely vertically integrated narco rebel terror group. And made gobs and gobs and gobs of money off the drug trade and used it to buy really sophisticated military equipment, such that they almost were able to take over Bogota in the late 1990s. Love this stuff. So we have to have this like very, kind of full-throated integrated approach because we hadn't really thought through the second and third order effects of our previous counter, war on drugs in Colombia. I say that because that will be relevant here in the second part of this conversation. But it's very much a supply side approach, right? We're going to do eradication. We're going to try to push back against the FARC. We're going to try to, do some alternate livelihoods, but like that never works like super great. Meanwhile, there is, incredibly robust demand for the product, which is, transferred into cocaine, primarily in North America, but increasingly in Europe as well.
All right. So we had some things that worked. We ended up with like a fairly robust, for a period of time, U.S. Colombia relationship. We, to a degree, strengthens Colombian state capacity. And maybe some years production actually went up. We didn't really do anything about much demand. Trafficking doesn't really disappear. And I'm interested, before we get into like where are we now, what has changed since those days? Like building on your point, Aaron, about how we dismantled the cartels and also built up the FARC, and now here we are today, where the networks have been fairly decentralized and fragmentary.
Yeah, so The Economist actually had a really good piece on this last week, and it's very much through the lens of the political economy of the narcotics trade, which, Rada will also probably love. But it turns out that basically drug markets work like most markets, right? That there's a lot of competition, there can be a lot of innovation. So, Lauren, as you know, right, there's been after this like vertically integrated period where the FARC dominated everything, as the FARC both moves toward a broader peace deal with the Colombian government and it's kind of fractured in terms of its domination of each segment of that market. We get a lot more specialization. So some folks really just do like transportation in the Caribbean route. Other folks are doing, creating new Pacific routes. Other folks are specialists in terms of like working with the Mexican cartels. There's been increasing activity in Europe, including some incredible innovation around how you transport precursors to cocaine, so coca powder, in things that don't look like cocaine and don't smell like cocaine, and then you do the chemical processes in Europe. So, I mean, it's straight out of the movies in some ways, except that it's a gajillion-dollar global trade. So it is a very resilient set of networks. It's a very distributed set of activities, and it's not exactly amenable to large-scale military strikes as disruption activities. Rod, I don't know if you have anything else on that.
Just like two additional pieces, which is one, I think this is like kind of harkening back to your second and third order effects. This is a little bit like in a game theory structure, like you've got a multi-game interaction here, and you have networks that are adapting through to the like forces that they've applied. So they are resilient to a lot of the pressure points we had before. I think that is relevant, though not entirely consistent with the current approach, but relevant to say that that previous approach that was focused on building partner capacity, which are now sort of like dirty words, and on a very integrated sort of intervention into a unitary monopolist structure, is just not effective in the current networks. And so we've seen, a long decade here of pretty middling impacts from things like interdictions and supply chain interruptions, because, and this is, I think, generally interesting, the supply chain resilience of these distribution networks is actually pretty good. And so I think just those pieces tell you something about both why things aren't working, but also I hesitate to use the word justify, but in a way to try to understand why extreme alternative actions might be something that gets put on the table. It is, what are the levers left to shock the network into a different kind of equilibrium or different kind of systems? And that, I think, is part of the backstory of how we got to where we are now.
All right, you guys are going to murder me because we are over time, but you all remember the downfall parodies that used to be shared on YouTube's? Okay. So my favorite one, which I have definitely mentioned on Bombshell before, is that like people tell Hitler about sequestration, and he goes on his like it's the usual downfall thing, and they tell him about like we got to cut the military budget, and he does his rant, and he ends it with, "What are we gonna do? Build partner capacity?" And I just loved that so much. It's just like a perfect encapsulation of like building partner capacity right there. Anyway, okay, so you have been Rumpelstiltskin. You have been asleep for years. You wake up and you're now suddenly in the middle of the Trump administration, and you're like, "I'm sorry, are we like using drones in the Caribbean? What's happening here?" So I want to there's obviously a lot of intellectual conversations we can have in this space, and we will try. But I really want to just try to encapsulate the weirdness of what is happening right now by starting with exactly this question of what is the weirdest thing that you are experiencing as a person who has lived in the national security space for the last 2 decades in the Southcom AOR. And I'll start with Rada.
So here is the like slightly out of body experience I have. Having worked in the special operations office in sort of 2011 to 2014 era, 2010, early 20. The amount of time and energy we put into contorting ourselves into justifying why these legislative authorizations, use of military force, meant we could cover all different kinds of Al-Qaeda adherents and its affiliates, drawing the line between groups that had literally split from Al-Qaeda, figuring out how we use it to cover it. Like just the mental gymnastics, the legal gymnastics, the parsing of continuing, comma imminent, and whether both had to be satisfied. All of that work on authorization of use of military force. And turns out we could have just said, meh, we don't like these guys and we're going to bomb them. And then just bomb them and not explained it to anyone and not justified it in any way, or just vaguely waved our hands at Article 2 and called it a day. And so like the combination of this like geographic scope where it's in the Caribbean, like just like you've got, as you said in the beginning, I think like victims washing up on the shores of Trinidad and these strikes, these movements of forces, and then the complete and lack of utter any effort even to like try to pretend that you could justify these uses of bill, even Article 2, even just anything that's like, this is why we believe these threats rise to the authority that we can conduct military operations. We can move military forces. We don't need congressional authorization. We don't need to justify it. I mean, I suppose a word is creative, but it is a real like,
another word is illegal.
It's like, yes. On the one hand, like, yes, but on the other hand, I mean, it's expedient. So yeah, anyway, this is my, like, I had joked once that the Zero Dark 30 should have just been a montage scene of varying increasingly more senior lawyers meetings. And apparently they've fired all the lawyers. So now they don't have those meetings.
All right. Well, mine, relatedly, is the resignation of Alvin Halsey, who is the United States Southcom commander, who resigned recently, but didn't really give a reason. And that is kind of insane to me for a lot of reasons. So let me say,
to be clear, he's a 4-star admiral, right?
Yes.
And he just decided that it was time to go.
I'm out.
He had been in command for a year and had a few years left on his tenure here. He has not, to my knowledge, disclosed any health reasons for his departure, any ethical reasons for his departure, or any other reasons of like, I'm out, time to go. And like all of those would have been totally fine. If you're going to leave your military 4-star admiral post early, which to be clear, Southcom is a good post. You are a god. You have a plane. You have lots of people. You apparently are in charge of like the main theater of operations in the United States military at this point in time. You live in Miami. He has resigned and has not used any of the moments he might have said, and here's why, to explain it. This comes at the point in time, like all of the things that we're talking about right now have happened under his tenure. He has already been overseeing. So if he had an ethical problem with anything that was going on, He's already been overseeing it. He could have used this as a moment to say, like, oh, it's bad. I don't want to be a part of this. Things continue to be under his tenure. So if he was fine with them, be like, hey, this is like you're leaving in the middle of the biggest moment of your career as we move F-35s and destroyers and carrier strike groups and conduct legal strikes in your area operations, and you're leaving. I have no problem with military officers saying, I cannot do this and I'm out. But usually it's and there's a reason, and you should know it because it's really important to national security to not just be like piecing out at a point in time in the middle of a really, really big deal that's going on. People in the US military culture make a really big deal out of resigning for ethical reasons, resigning for a point, leaving in order to make an objection of some kind. That is apparently not what is happening right now, and it blows my mind.
So I'm torn between our pursuit of potentially two, how should I say it, insane policies tied up in all of these movements. Two policies that I would have thought were pretty thoroughly debunked in our adult lives. One of which we've sort of talked about, right, which is using large-scale military force in a drug war. This is, generally speaking, not how we have pursued this for the last 30-ish years, for good reason. It's very easy to get pulled in. It's very difficult to get yourself back out. The sort of nature of the demand and the resilience of the networks, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, means that it's very difficult to like actually get to some sort of victory type moment. So that's the drug war, military force for a drug war. The alternate explanation of like why there's a strike group in the Caribbean, for example, is something to do with regime change in Venezuela. Again, I say to you,
oh yeah,
things that I thought we had learned
talk about that, yeah,
in our adult lives. I didn't realize that we were back in the business of forcible regime change, nor did I realize the Trump administration was in the business of forcible regime change. I mean,
this is like the craziest part. I was like, I thought you guys, the best part of your platform is no more forever wars.
No more forever wars, any of it. Nope, we're going to go do the most foreverest of the forever wars.
Yes.
And also, by the way, do you guys know who the best ally in the region is against like shenanigans in Venezuela?
Colombia.
So why are you pissing off the place that you would use to stage certainly the intel portion of all of these sorts of things?
No. Let's go sanction the president and his family. That's a great idea.
Yeah. So it's a lot of Whiskey Tango Foxtrot over. I cannot figure. I mean, it's a real, choose your own adventure there of which is the weirdest thing.
Okay. Well, there's a lot. There's just like a lot going on in Southcom, and Candlesticks make a nice gift. I'm sure we will be back here. This is one of those, like, I thought we were done with the Middle East wars, and we're still kind of like vaguely in. I never thought we would be here. So, welcome back to anyone who like assumed that we would be back in war in South America in some way. With that, we're going to transition over to warning signs. For warning signs this week, we are digging into the Pentagon press corps. We've been mentioning over the past several weeks various things that are going on between Secretary Hegseth, the media, the increasingly hostile or tense or stressful or kind of bizarre relationship that we are seeing going on between the press and the Department of Defense, or actually right now, Department of War, which, how do you even say that? DOW? Like, that's just like a ridiculous acronym. And we wanted to spend some time with an amazing longtime friend of the show, friend of ours, who has been spending a lot of her career working on covering the Department of Defense, the military, the industrial base, and many things related to this, and talk through what does this mean not only for like the near term in terms of the relationship between the Department of Defense and the media that covers it, but also what does it mean for democracy or institutions and the ability to hold the Department of Defense accountable based on what a democratic military should look like. So we are just so excited to welcome Valerie Insinna, who is a congressional and industry reporter with Breaking Defense, back to the show. I say back to the show because prior bombshell guest, delighted to have her back in this conversation. And for today, we want to kick off with a first question for you, Val, which is a really basic one that you have experience with of like, let's think about the before times when you had a Pentagon badge tell us what you would describe as a typical, if there is one, day in the life of a Pentagon reporter? Do you just like wander around the Pentagon and like run into the Secretary of Defense in the hallway? Do you meet the chairman for lunch? Do you get lost like everybody else? What's that like?
Definitely get lost. Less so meeting the chairman for lunch. That would be cool. But sadly, most of the time the chairman and the secretary, they're not going down to Popeyes in the food court to pick up a chicken sandwich the way that I would.
They
Um,
absolutely should, though. No question.
they should.
Mhm.
I think it would improve their day, but maybe not like the whole physical fitness sort of thing. So yeah, a typical day. So I think to give your listeners sort of a picture of where the press usually works out of, there are two bullpens and then a bunch of video booths that are located next to the Pentagon briefing room. So there's this sort of like enclave for the press. And next to that where all of the OSD, the Office of Secretary of Defense, public affairs people kind of all sit. So during a typical day, I'd be at one of those desks in the bullpen, and I'd be doing interviews. I'd be writing my stories. A lot of times I would walk over to the PAOs for OSD, or I would venture around to the service PAOs. They're located in different offices around the building. Sometimes it's because, I wanted a question answered. Sometimes it's just because I like to chat. I'm a gabber. And so, you just stop by Air Force public affairs and annoy them until they tell me to go away, and bother them with questions about, did you see this television show or whatever else? Um, so I think one thing in this whole discussion that's kind of been mischaracterized a little bit is the amount of access that Pentagon reporters have. We have access to all of the unclassified spaces in the Pentagon.
Mhm.
Um, we have a similar level of movement as the guys working at Starbucks or like the janitors, but those people actually have way more access than we do because the janitors can like go into certain offices that we cannot get into.
And before we get to the most recent events, maybe it's just helpful for context to take a second and sort of, since the change in administration. So prior to this, newest set of things that reporters were asked to decide, how have things been different this year? Overall, or have they been different? Was this sort of change out of the blue, or has there been a sense of an end of that kind of special type of relationship?
I think that it was a pretty dramatic change from the get-go. Broadly speaking, I think there's always been certain norms that were preserved in the past, even within the first Trump administration. There would be pretty frequent briefings, either on camera or off, or there would be, you would have journalists go on trips. There was
Yep.
just traditions that were kind of upheld of, you know, like certain news networks had their spaces for filming. Since coming in, I think Hegseth and his team has made it pretty clear that they don't really understand or respect the work that we do as journalists. Um, Very quickly after coming in, they kicked out, a couple of media outlets from their desks. And when the Pentagon Press Association, approached the administration and asked them to reconsider the situation, they basically doubled down and said, thanks for your input, instead of, this amount of people or this amount of outlets that were going to demand that they leave their spots. We're actually doubling that number. And they, for the most part, replaced those like long held spots with right wing news outlets. And then, months later, they announced new restrictions about where the reporters could actually go within the building. And again, to restate, like to begin with, we were not allowed to go in any sort of classified area, or, we did not have access to certain offices. But now we're restricted to a point where we can really only go to OSD public affairs and the cafeteria we don't even have the ability to walk over to Army public affairs or Navy public affairs or Air Force public affairs, which is, really, really unfortunate. And then in September, we got this new requirement to be able to keep our badges. We had to sign this agreement. I think on top of that, just the way that the administration talks about the media, the way that the department leadership talks about the media is very different from in the past. It's very combative. I don't think we've ever seen that in the past. There's almost a lack of professionalism in some cases. Like, I think everyone saw Hegseth calling out Jen Griffith from Fox, who's someone that has a ton of respect, no matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, that's someone that is sort of known for shooting straight. So I think that is telling for just the overall level of the relationship and how that's changed, I suppose.
You mentioned the agreement you all asked to sign. And so just to lay out bare facts, can you just lay out a little bit here's what you were asked to sign, but I think somewhat more importantly, most of us are not journalists who are listening to this episode. Why was that antithetical to how both you and the broader Pentagon press corps approach your roles? And why did I think more or less as a body, the large papers in the defense trades, they chose not to sign this agreement and walked away. So just love to hear a little bit more about that, and then we can get more into the so how does this work now? What world are we in at this point?
Yeah. So essentially, the department gave us a 21-page document, which was very different than the single-page document that we had to sign in the past to get a badge. I kind of want to debunk two myths that I think the administration kind of keeps talking about. We already, had to wear our Pentagon badges every time we were in the building, have them visible above our, on our chest. So we were already doing that. That was not an issue for us. And in terms of the other thing that they keep talking about is we wanted unfettered access to the building. Again, we wanted to just retain the access that we already have. We weren't looking to try to get into classified areas. We understand that those areas need to be kept for classified information. The big issue was that there was language in there that essentially kind of criminalized talking to reporters. Basically said that anyone in the Defense Department needed to have formal permission to talk to a reporter, and if they didn't have that permission, they were committing some sort of criminal act. And it implied that any reporter that tried to solicit information, even if it was trying to get information that was unclassified, hey, if you know anything about this, send me an email. You can reach me on Signal. That could be seen as trying to solicit classified or sensitive information, and that we could be kicked out of the Pentagon or potentially even legally prosecuted. So there were really serious concerns among the lawyers of all of the news organizations that we could potentially open ourselves up to criminal charges by signing this document and saying that we understand what DOD is saying to be true. So, only 2 reporters out of the 110 members of the Pentagon Press Association signed the new agreement. It was an Indian freelancer and the reporter for OAN. But I think it's really also important to note that there are tons of conservative media outlets that said, no, we can't do this. Our lawyers say we cannot do this, from Fox News, Washington Times, Newsmax. They all took a look at this and they're like, nope, this is not something we're willing to do because it just opens us up to litigation potentially.
If you enjoyed the beginning of our discussion with Valerie Insinna, a reporter with Breaking Defense and longtime Pentagon press corps member, check out our mini episode for our 30-minute interview with Val coming out later this week. So for the Gong Show this week, I think we're a little delayed in having this conversation, and really it's a conversation that everybody should have in their lives. And that is when you are protesting the bad people, whoever the bad people are in your life, what is the blow up costume that you would take along for a ride, as it were?
So I have to say, when I was Googling some possible answers to this, I was really hopeful that the Hello Kitty character Bots Maru would have a proper inflatable costume to go along. He's like the eye-rolling penguin, and that's very much my jam. Sadly, there is not. There is, however, a hippo with a tutu, and I kind of feel like that would be a fun way to go to the protest. So hippo with tutu is how I believe I would roll in a protest with the bad people.
Rada, I know that you think about this sort of question like late at night. What is it you are going to do?
Well, obviously, I would be a rainbow unicorn.
Obviously,
yes.
Just let's be clear. Also, maybe put some crown jewels on it while we're at it. I mean, if we're protesting, here we are.
If you're going to have street theater, you should really do it up.
For a penny. But I will say that I have a growing affection for the frogs, because I had assumed they were like identical frogs, but similarly in researching this, determined there are a variety of frogs. There are frogs with tutus. There are frogs with crowns. There are frogs with spotted things and neckties. The frog is not wearing any other clothes. Why would he put on a tie? That can't be comfortable. And yet, here we are. So I don't know.
Do frogs even have necks? I mean, questions. Anyway. Yeah. Lauren, what is your inflatable protest costume?
So I just feel like all of these costumes would be very sweaty. And so I am going to So I'm going to do the one where you are half out of it, but it appears as though you are riding on an animal, like one with a horse. And I just really want to get like a rooster or a chicken costume. There's not any good reason why, except for just like roosters. Those are awesome. I kind of love them as creatures. So like me on the back of a rooster, wandering around, protesting the fascists. That seems like a good way to start the day.
I just will note that in my head, every time anyone refers to chicken, all I hear is lava chicken playing over and over again. And that's now what I will see of you riding a rooster.
Lava chicken. All right. Well, this closes another amazing episode of Sirens. If you have not rated us on your podcast platform of choice, why not? Tell us how much you love us, or don't tell us anything else. Just tell us how much you love us. We'll see you next time.